Have you ever thought about what it means to be a multicellular organism? Probably not, but maybe that's because it seems like an obvious question. I mean, if an organism has more than one cell, it's multicellular. Case closed, right? Well, let's look at an example to see how easy it really is. If we have a colony of bacteria growing in a petri dish, do we define the colony as one multicellular organism, or billions of organisms living all piled on top of each other? Let's start by defining an organism. An organism is defined as an individual living thing that is capable of responding to stimuli, growing, reproducing, and maintaining homeostasis. Because each cell in the bacterial colony can perform all of these essential functions by itself, we define each cell as its own organism. By contrast, a multicellular organism is made up of many cells that are dependent on each other to perform these essential functions as a group. The cells have divided up the labor, and each cell has become specialized to perform a specific task. This specialization is a key characteristic of multicellular organisms. But why specialize? If a cell cannot perform all essential functions on its own, doesn't that limit what it can do? The answer to this question really depends on the level of organization that you're looking at, and there are several levels of organization within an organism. Starting at the cellular level, each cell has its own set of functions and requirements that it must carry out. Most cells form groups called tissues, which are groups of cells that share a common structure and function within an organism. Tissues are the next level of organization in an organism, and are often very specialized to perform only one or maybe a few very specific tasks. For instance, muscle tissue is specialized to contract, and that's about all that it does. The next level of organization above tissues is organs. An organ is a structure composed of several different tissues that work together to perform a certain task. The tissues within an organ work together to perform more complicated tasks than any one tissue is capable of. An example of an organ would be the heart. The heart is mostly muscle tissue, but is also composed of connective tissue, which provides structure for the heart, an epithelial layer that serves as a barrier to keep the blood contained in the chambers, and nervous tissue, which regulates the heart rate. Together, these tissues perform the more complicated task of pumping blood. But we're not done yet. There's another level of organization above organs, and that is the organ system, which is a group of organs and tissues that work together to perform a major function of the organism. Let's go back to our heart example. The heart is one organ within the circulatory system, which is composed of the heart, blood vessels, and blood. The heart pumps blood, but the whole circulatory system working together circulates blood throughout the body. And finally, the last level of organization is the organism itself, which as a whole is capable of all essential functions. So back to the question of whether or not specialized cells are more limited than single-celled organisms. At the cellular level, the specialized cell is limited to performing its specific task and is more limited than a single-celled organism. However, at the organismal level, specialization and division of labor opens up almost limitless possibilities for variation of structures. And it frees multicellular organisms from the limits of single-celled organisms in terms of size and complexity. In this set of lessons, we're going to talk about the anatomy and functions of animals, with a particular emphasis on humans. Let's start by talking about tissues. In a human being, there are dozens of very specific tissues, but they can be classified into four main tissue types: connective tissue, epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the characteristics and functions of epithelial tissue. We'll talk about connective, muscle, and nervous tissue when we talk about those systems. Epithelial tissue is tissue that is organized into tightly packed sheets of cells that line organs and body cavities. In epithelial tissues, one or more layers of cells completely covers a basement membrane, which is a well-defined layer of extracellular matrix that serves as a base for epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissues can take many forms. They can be as simple as a single layer of very flat cells, like the epithelial cells right here that line this blood vessel, or they can be a very complex mix of cells of different shapes and composition, like all of these epithelial cells of the human skin in this picture here. Epithelial tissues can also serve several functions. One major function of epithelial tissue, and especially skin, is to serve as a barrier to protect against injury, invading organisms, and loss of fluids. But epithelial tissues aren't just limited to serving as barriers. Some epithelial tissues are specialized to absorb nutrients, like the epithelial tissues of the small intestine. You may notice in this picture of the small intestine that we have a well-defined layer of epithelial cells here that sit on a very thin basement membrane that you can barely see here. And underneath you have connective tissue right about here. The epithelial cells come in contact with the contents of the small intestine and are organized into these finger-like structures here. These structures are called villi and are finger-like projections of epithelial tissue which increase surface area. The increased surface area created by the villi allow a greater number of epithelial cells to have access to nutrients in the small intestine, and therefore increases absorption efficiency. Other epithelial tissues like prostate gland epithelium are specialized for secretion of proteins. In this section through the prostate gland, we can see the round blue nuclei of the prostate epithelial cells that line the ducts of the gland. In addition, one of the secretory products of the prostate has been stained brown in this particular section to show which cells are actively secreting proteins into the ducts. And as you can see based on the brown color, pretty much every cell lining the ducts is actively secreting proteins. And finally, some epithelia, like the lining of our respiratory tract, have some cells that secrete mucus, and other cells that have lots of small cilia on their cell surface that move the mucus and trap particles out of the lungs. Here is a picture which shows a section through a ciliated epithelium. In this picture, you can see a very prominent basement membrane here, with several layers of cells on top. And then, in the very top layer, you can see some cells which secrete mucus here, here, and here, and other cells that have visible cilia located here, here, and here. The mucus cells secrete mucus, which is then moved by the cilia cells out of the lung. So let's review. Multicellular organisms were created when cells started to specialize and divide up the labor among themselves. These groups of specialized cells that share a common structure and function are called tissues. In animals, there are four main tissue types: connective tissue, epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. Epithelial tissue is tissue that is organized into tightly packed sheets of cells that line organs and body cavities. Epithelial tissues can serve several purposes, with the three major functions being protection, secretion, and absorption. In epithelial tissues, one or more layers of cells completely covers a basement membrane, which is a well-defined layer of extracellular matrix that serves as a base for epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissues can take many forms. They can be as simple as a single layer of very flat cells like the epithelial tissue that lines blood vessels, or they can be a complex mix of cells of different shapes and composition like the epithelial tissue of the human skin.
If you're the type of person who loves to bake in the sun, then you've probably experienced something called a tan or sunburn. The sunburn and tan you may have acquired involved sunlight, certain layers of your skin, and the cells within those layers. You see, the sun's light rays travel through space, then through the Earth's atmosphere, and finally hit your skin as you lie on the beach sipping a non-alcoholic pina colada with a little umbrella sticking out of the glass. The first topmost or superficial layer of the skin the sun's rays hit is called the epidermis. Again, the epidermis is the outermost layer of the skin. The epidermis is itself made up of several layers. From outer to innermost, they are the stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basale. Do note, however, that the stratum lucidum is typically only found in places like the soles of your feet or the palms of your hand. Regardless, it's pretty easy to remember the exact order of the layers of the epidermis. Since we're on the topic of possible sunburns, the coolest mnemonic to remember the layers of the epidermis from top to bottom or superficial to deepest is "Come, let's get sunburn." Each word's first letter represents the first letter of each layer. In case you were wondering, the epidermis is actually the layer of skin that is primarily affected in most cases of sunburn and begins to peel off if damaged by the light's dangerous UV rays. However, your skin isn't a weakling and does have a defense mechanism that tries to fight off dangerous ultraviolet rays found in sunlight. In the deepest layer of the epidermis, the stratum basale, which is also sometimes called the basal layer, are cells called melanocytes. These are cells that produce the pigment melanin. It is this substance, melanin, which determines the skin color of an individual. Those with larger amounts of melanin in their skin have darker skin, or their skin darkens with more exposure to sunlight. Basically, as the sunlight hits your skin, the light rays stimulate the production of melanin by melanocytes. Since the majority of melanin is called eumelanin, which is a brownish-black color, your skin begins to darken as more melanin is produced. Keep in mind that this melanin isn't produced to give you a nice tan for aesthetic reasons, but instead helps protect you from cancer-causing ultraviolet radiation found in the sunlight that is baking and peeling your skin off at the beach. At least the pale vampires who come out after twilight don't have to worry about this. Pale vampires aside, your epidermis has other cells that are quite important. One of these cells are called keratinocytes. Keratinocytes are cells that eventually die in order to comprise the majority of the stratum corneum. The keratinocytes actually originate in the stratum basale, but as they mature and age, they move from the deepest to the most superficial layer of the epidermis. Once the really old keratinocytes reach the stratum corneum, they are known as corneocytes. The corneocytes are basically the cells that are shed off of your skin and become part of the dust floating around you. Disgusting, isn't it? When you inhale dust, you also inhale dead human skin cells. As yucky as that might sound, the keratinocytes do play a lot of important roles. One of these roles actually involves the melanin produced by melanocytes. The keratinocytes take up and store some of the melanin produced by the melanocytes, and this gives your skin an extra layer of protection from the damaging ultraviolet radiation of the sun's light rays. In addition to housing young keratinocytes and melanocytes, the basal layer of your skin also contains other cells, such as Merkel cells, which are cells that are important in the sensation of touch. With all of that in mind, I do have an important point to make. The topmost layer of your skin we are going over, the epidermis, is made up of something called squamous cells, which are basically a bunch of really flat cells. Bearing those squamous cells in mind, the basal layer of the epidermis, where the Merkel cells and melanocytes are located, it should come as absolutely no shocker that squamous cell carcinoma, basal cell carcinoma, Merkel cell carcinoma, and melanoma are just some of the types of skin cancer you can get due to overexposure to damaging ultraviolet radiation from the sun's light rays. The next time you're frying at the beach, remember, your tan may be pretty, but skin cancer looks really nasty. Furthermore, in serious cases of sunburn, even the next layer of skin, the layer right underneath the epidermis, can be affected. This layer of skin is called the dermis, and it is the middle layer of the skin, right below the epidermis. The dermis is separated from the epidermis by something called the basement membrane, which is basically a thin sheet of tissue that anchors down the epidermis to the deeper levels of the skin and also helps to prevent the passage of certain cells and molecules between the two layers. Furthermore, the dermis contains glands, nerves, blood vessels, and hair follicles. In addition, the dermis has a famous protein called collagen, which gives our skin its strength and some elasticity. With age, a poor diet, or sun exposure, the collagen will break down, and this will lead to the sagging and wrinkling of our skin. The deepest layer of skin is the subcutis or subcutaneous layer. It is located right below the dermis. It is also sometimes called the hypodermis. Note that the words subcutaneous or hypodermis translate as under the skin. So, when you get a subcutaneous injection with a hypodermic needle, the needle goes below the epidermis and dermis and into this level. In addition to blood vessels and nerves, the subcutis layer of the skin is made up of adipose tissue, also known as body fat, and other types of connective tissue as well. Well, if you ever need something to distract you from the thought of cancer and wrinkle-inducing death rays the sun provides you with free of charge, try reviewing the important points of this lesson with me. The epidermis is the outermost layer of the skin. The dermis is the middle layer of the skin, and the subcutis is the innermost layer of the skin. In the epidermis, there are cells that eventually die in order to comprise the majority of the stratum corneum. These cells are called keratinocytes. Also, within the basal layer of the epidermis, there are cells called melanocytes. These are cells that produce the pigment melanin. Finally, the basal layer of the epidermis also contains cells called Merkel cells, which are cells that are important in the sensation of touch. For those of you who grew up playing with Legos, you surely would have noticed that despite the wide variety of shapes and colors, they were still basically little plastic bricks. Epithelial tissue, the type of tissue that lines the surfaces and cavities of your body's organs, is no different. Epithelial tissue is like the brand name Lego. Lego has differently sized and shaped blocks, and epithelial tissue has differently sized and shaped cells. Lego blocks can be arranged into differently shaped structures, and epithelial cells can be arranged into differently shaped structures as well. Regardless of the shape, size, or arrangement of the cells, they are still a type of or part of epithelial tissue, just like all our differently sized, shaped, and arranged plastic bricks are still Legos. Epithelial tissue has differently shaped bricks, or cells, that is. There are columnar cells, which means column-like cells. Cuboidal cells, which are cube-like cells, and squamous cells, which are flattened and scale-like cells. Basically, columnar cells are much higher than they are wide. Cuboidal cells look like squares, and squamous cells are flat like turtles and therefore not very tall at all. What we've just done in terms of the columnar, cuboidal, and squamous cells is gone over the three different Lego shapes of our epithelium. We can take each of these Lego shapes and arrange them in different ways to build a structure. If we arrange any cell shape in a single layer, we would call it simple epithelial tissue. Again, simple epithelial tissue is a single cell layer of epithelial tissue. However, if we begin to stack our shapes one on top of another, regardless of whether it's two layers or more, this would be called stratified epithelial tissue, which is an epithelial tissue that is more than one cell layer thick. Unfortunately, life isn't always as easy as we want it to be. There are exceptions to the three shapes and the two different arrangements of layering we just went over. One of these exceptions is known as pseudostratified columnar epithelium, which is a type of tissue that has a single layer of cells arranged in a fashion that appears stratified. Basically, it's like taking a bunch of very flexible Lego pieces, arranging them in a one-layer thick structure, but then bending and twisting this one layer to make it look like there's actually more than one layer when that's actually false. So, it shouldn't surprise you that the prefix pseudo means false in Latin. Hence, something that is pseudo, in our case pseudostratified, looks to be stratified when it's actually not. Since the only alternative to stratified epithelial tissue is simple epithelial tissue, you know that the pseudostratified columnar epithelium has got to be only one layer of columnar cells. The second exception to our cell shapes and arrangements is actually pretty darn cool. It's called transitional epithelial tissue. This tissue is transitional, meaning it doesn't stay the same shape for long, as it transitions from one shape to another as necessary. In simple terms, transitional epithelial tissue is an elastic-like epithelial tissue that swells, contracts, and changes shape as necessary in order to accommodate something. One of the places this tissue is found is in your bladder. When your bladder is empty, the transitional cells look to be cuboidal in shape. However, as the bladder fills up, the urine in the bladder stretches the bladder walls, which stretch out the cuboidal cells and cause them to become flat or squamous in shape instead. This is so cool that not even Lego blocks can do this. Regardless of which shape of epithelial tissue we talked about in this lesson, keep in mind that all epithelial tissue relies on a structure called a basement membrane. This is basically a thin sheet of tissue underneath the epithelium that helps to anchor the epithelium to deeper tissues. The basement membrane also helps to allow certain substances to pass through or blocks them from doing so in order to keep the epithelium alive. It's good to have the basement membrane on your side, because if there wasn't any, you wouldn't have much epithelial tissue. For example, your body's skin would basically slide right off of you like a glove off of your hand. This would be bad, since epithelial tissue is responsible for many things, like the protection of underlying tissue from things like the sun, trauma, or bacteria, and the secretion and exchange of important enzymes, hormones, and sweat. Hopefully, the amount of information in this lesson isn't making you sweat. Let's review the important parts you need to grasp from this lesson. Recall that epithelial tissue has differently shaped bricks or cells, that is. There are columnar cells, which means column-like cells, cuboidal cells, which are cube-like cells, and squamous cells, which are flattened and scale-like cells. A single cell layer of epithelial tissue is called simple epithelial tissue, while stratified epithelial tissue is an epithelial tissue that is more than one cell layer thick. Keep in mind, however, there's always a rule breaker out there in the world, and it's no different with epithelial tissue. Pseudostratified columnar epithelium is a type of tissue that has a single layer of cells arranged in a fashion that appears to be stratified, whereas transitional epithelial tissue is an elastic-like epithelial tissue that swells, contracts, and changes shape as necessary. When it comes down to the directional terminology in the human body, you say potato and I say potato, but in the end we'd still be talking about the same thing. In order to make your life more difficult and theirs easier, scientists and medical practitioners have come up with and use more proper or technical words in order to reference the location or direction of something. In this lesson, we'll look into some of the more common and general terms involved in referencing location and direction with respect to our body. One of the terms commonly used is the word anterior. You should be aware that it means that something is towards the front of the body, or is more towards the front of the body than something else. Conversely, the word posterior means that something is towards the back of the body, or more towards the back of the body than another thing when comparing two different structures. For example, the sternum, our breastbone, is anterior to our spine, and our spine is posterior to our breastbone, since the breastbone is towards the front of our body and the spine is toward the back of our body. It's easy to remember which term is which. The prefix ante in anterior means before, like when you ante up prior to the start of a poker game, or when someone is before you in a lunch line, meaning they're actually in front of you. For the word posterior, the prefix post in posterior means after, like when the mail is only delivered after you put postage on your letter, and if you don't use postage, you'll get your letter delivered right back to you. So, posterior means towards the back, and anterior means towards the front. Now, there are more directional terms than just toward the front or back of something. We also have the term superior, which means towards the head or above something, and the word inferior, which means towards the feet or below something. It's easy to remember which word refers to what, since people who think they're superior to others tend to walk around with their chin up and head held high, looking down upon the inferior swaths of hapless nincompoops below them. From a more realistic anatomical perspective, one example to help you understand these terms is by realizing that the head is superior to or above the shoulders, while the heart is inferior to or below the neck. A lot of people, regardless of whether they think they're inferior or superior, say beauty is only skin deep. Furthermore, those who are constantly obsessed with their beauty are oftentimes called superficial. Not surprisingly, the term superficial means closer to the skin or body surface, while deep means further away from the skin or body surface, like those of us who consider ourselves to be deep and not concerned with superficial things like the beauty of our skin. As an anatomical example, you can remember which is which by recalling that your intestines or guts are deeper to your abs, which are right underneath the skin, while the abs are superficial to the intestines. Let's not call the whole lesson off just yet, and instead let's review our terms to solidify them in our brain. Recall that the word anterior means that something is towards the front of the body, while the word posterior means that something is towards the back of the body. We also have the term superior, which means towards the head or above something, and the word inferior, which means towards the feet or below something. Finally, the term superficial means closer to the skin or body surface, while deep means further away from the skin or body surface. Some people love to sleep on their side. Some are very particular, only preferring one side, while others are not picky and can sleep on one side or on the opposite side. If you know someone who sleeps on a side opposite your favorite side, there's a word for that side. If you know someone who sleeps on the same side as your favorite side, there's a word for that side too. Had enough of the sides? Sides aside, let's get to the main part of this lesson instead. If you were to lie down in bed, on your back this time, and draw an imaginary line down the very center or middle of your body, stretching from the top of your head down to the soles of your feet, this would be called the midline of your body, with the word midline referring to the fact that the line is in the middle of your body, or on what's known as the median plane. Now, draw a little dot just to the side of the midline and another dot almost all the way at the edge of your body, as far away from the midline as possible. Something that is farther away from the midline is lateral, while something that is closer to the midline is termed medial. Hence, the dot farthest away from the midline is on the lateral aspect of your body and is lateral to the dot closest to the midline. On the other hand, the dot closest to the midline is medial to the dot farthest away from the midline. In simple terms, something lateral is to or on the side of something else, while something medial is toward the middle of something. It should come as no surprise, then, that the inner part of your thigh, the inner thigh, is the medial part of your thigh, since it's the closest to the imaginary midline we drew, while the outer thigh is the lateral part of your thigh. Another important couple of terms have to do with the specific side of the midline you're on. For example, the right leg and right arm are ipsilateral, meaning they're affecting or on the same side of the body. This is in contrast or in direct opposition to the right leg and left arm, which are contralateral or affecting or on the opposite side of the body. It should be easy to remember that contralateral means the opposite side of the body, since contra in contralateral means opposite or against, whereas the term ipsi means the same in Latin. Hence, ipsilateral is on the same side. Now that we've put that aside, let's quickly go over all of our terms in additional time. Ipsilateral means something that's affecting or on the same side of the body, whereas contralateral means that something is affecting or on the opposite side of the body. Something that is farther away from the midline of your body is lateral, while something that is closer to the midline is termed medial. That's it. 4 simple terms, all referencing their relationship to the midline, or their comparative relationship to the midline based on another point. Planes, trains, and automobiles are often cut up for scraps. They can be cut in many different directions, depending on exactly what it is you're trying to get from them. The same type of concept goes for your body. We can cut it up, metaphorically and realistically, in many different directions. Let's see how we can slice and dice a person and for what important purposes we may sometimes have to do this. One cut or direction or plane, however you want to term it, is known as the median plane. This is a vertical plane that divides the body into equal right and left halves. Basically, we cut the person in a straight vertical line from the head through the belly button and down to the toes. The median plane, therefore, creates equal right and left halves of our body. Any vertical plane that is parallel to the median plane is known as the sagittal plane. With that in mind, it should come as no surprise that sometimes the median plane is referenced as the mid-sagittal plane, and the sagittal planes are sometimes called paramedian planes, as the prefix para refers to something that's side by side, or in our case, parallel to something else. You can remember what the median plane is by recalling the fact that a highway median, the barrier or strip of land running down the middle of the highway, divides the highway into right and left halves, just like the median plane of our body does. Another totally different type of cut or plane we can achieve with the body is known as the coronal plane. This is a plane that separates the body into anterior and posterior parts. In essence, this plane intersects the median plane at a 90-degree angle and therefore splits the body into front and back halves. This type of division is why the coronal plane is sometimes referred to as the frontal plane. Hence, it's easy to remember that the frontal plane divides the body into front and therefore back parts. Also, the word frontal shares the same 2 last letters as the word coronal. Hence, you'll always know they're one and the same. Finally, we can also cut the body using the transverse plane. This is a plane that divides the body into superior and inferior portions. This plane runs perpendicular to the coronal and median planes, and in an upright human is parallel or horizontal to the ground. This is why it's also called the horizontal plane. The transverse plane can be remembered if you remember it is also the horizontal plane. The word horizontal is the key term here. The horizontal plane runs from side to side, or horizontally. Hence, it divides your body into top and bottom halves instead. Regardless of how you best recall which plane divides the body into which parts, the practical reasons for this terminology sometimes have to do with something called histopathology. This is when we cut tissue up into microscopically thin slices in order to examine the tissue for diagnostic or educational purposes. For example, we may slice and dice a potential tumor to see how invasive it is in the surrounding tissue. Depending on the exact nature of the tissue we are dealing with, we may cut it in different planes to give us a better view of what's going on. Likewise, we sometimes divide a human being into theoretical slices, meaning we don't literally cut up a person or part of them. We only theoretically divide the human up. For instance, a CT machine is something that takes many radiographs at once in order to help us form an image that we can virtually slice through in any plane we want in order to help us see what's going on inside of the body. All of these planes, regardless of whether a histopathologist or radiologist uses them, are important to know in order to understand critical reference points in science and medicine. Now that you know that learning all of these planes is truly important, let's review them so you don't forget them too soon. The median plane is a vertical plane that divides the body into equal right and left halves, and any vertical plane that is parallel to the median plane is known as the sagittal plane. The coronal plane is a plane that separates the body into anterior and posterior parts and is sometimes known as the frontal plane. Finally, the transverse plane is a plane that divides the body into superior and inferior portions and is sometimes called the horizontal plane as well. If you're into gardening, then you certainly love to use your palms to plant all sorts of beautiful flowers. If you haven't caught on already, that last sentence had a couple of clues as to what we're going to get into in this lesson, namely discussing the basic terminology with respect to the appendages of our body. That is to say, the feet that move our body and the hands that carry the flower bulbs we're going to be planting. With that in mind, take a look at the flower bulbs in the palm of your hand. The side of your hand that is palming or grasping the flower bulbs is called the palmar aspect of your hand, which again is a term that describes something located in, on, or pertaining to the palm of the hand. The opposite side of your hand, the back of your hand, is called the dorsal aspect of the hand. The term dorsal refers to something that is towards the back of something. In this case, it's the back of our hand. Those of you who love animals will have no trouble remembering the definition of the term dorsal, as I'm sure you've heard of a dorsal fin that marine mammals and fish have. It's the fin on their back. Hence, dorsal pertains to the back of something. Well, as you dream of freeing Willy, you'll walk over to where you're going to plant the bulbs that will turn into soulful flowers. While walking, you'll also plant your feet as you walk. Hence, the plantar surface refers to the sole of the foot. The sole of the foot is like the palm of the hand, while the backside, so to speak, of the foot is known as the dorsal surface, just like the back of the hand is known as well. As you toil away planting the bulbs, you manage to get a couple of scratches. One of the scratches is on your wrist, and the other is on your upper arm. With respect to your body's appendages, the point on an appendage that is nearer the body from which an appendage is originating is known as the proximal point, whereas the point farther away from the body from which an appendage is originating is known as the distal point. Both of these words are relative and not absolute. This means that something is considered to be proximal or distal relative to its position to something else. We can use a modified version of Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man to help illustrate this point. In this image, a man's entire arm radiates out of its point of attachment at the torso, at a point we call the shoulder. Therefore, the cut on your upper arm is closest to the trunk of your body, and is therefore the proximal most cut, and is proximal to the cut at the wrist. The cut at the wrist is the distal most cut, and is distal to the cut on the upper arm, since your wrist is farthest away from the trunk of the body. What if we had only one cut on the entire arm? If we had a cut at the elbow, then everything coming after the cut, furthest away from the torso, would be distal to the cut, and everything coming before the cut, that is to say, closest to the torso, would be proximal to the cut. Similarly, you should now be able to understand that the wrist is distal to the elbow, while the elbow is proximal to the wrist, since it's nearer the trunk of the body. With the great Renaissance man's help, I hope that explanation was clear enough so that we can focus on reviewing the material we just went over. For example, the palmar aspect of your hand is a term that describes something located in, on, or pertaining to the palm of the hand. On the other hand, no pun intended, the opposite side of your hand, the back of your hand that is called the dorsal aspect of the hand. The term dorsal, again, refers to something that is towards the back. Furthermore, recall that you plant your feet as you walk. Hence, the plantar surface refers to the sole of the foot. Finally, with respect to your body's appendages, the point on an appendage that is nearer the body from which an appendage is originating from is known as the proximal point, whereas the point farther away from the body from which an appendage is originating from is known as the distal point.